lifetime prepared me for what, what we were about to see.
Što sam ja vidio u svojih 73 godine, bio sam 42. u logoru, bio sam 45. godine u logoru, ali ovaj logor to nije zamisliti.
Thing that I couldn't understand was sort of in the late part of the 20th century that this sort of thing was still going on, and the viciousness.
Jesu to ljudi? To zvijer ne bi napravili. Sram svakog da bude ko to radi.
A door opened in a hangar, a large rust-coloured hangar, and these men appeared, jogged, drilled across the yard in various dilapidated states, some of them skeletally thin with their heads shaven, and that's when you started to think, where am I and what epoch am I in? There's nothing like the eyes of a prisoner that wants to tell you something they can't. It's a burn, it's a eyes on fire, fear and desperation. Off we went to Ternopil. There was a site in this field on the left-hand side of the road, which boggled the mind. A row of men up against a fence, barbed wire fence, some of them skeletal, others not so. I think as amazed to see us as we were to see them. The scene is, I think, fairly famous now. But then we went round into the building itself. There was a sort of medical centre, and two people running it. Heroic, this whole story is a story of unsung heroes. And heroines in this case. One of them was a vet called Azra Blažević, the other was a doctor called Iris Merjanić. My dear friend and colleague Penny Marshall asked him, are there beatings? And he sort of rolled his eyes. Azra Blažević, meanwhile, I remember she said to me, she said, it is as bad as you think. Then she slipped as a roll of film, undeveloped, which had on it what turned out to be the first actual images of what was going on.
On the 6th of August 1992, British journalists from ITN and Guardian unveiled to the world the existence of camps for non-Serb civilians in the area of Prijedor in northwestern Bosnia and Herzegovina. Shocking images of emaciated inmates in just a few days circled the planet and shook the conscience of humanity. Barely 2 months later, a process was set in motion which would change the face of international criminal justice forever.
The Commission of Experts was set up under Professor Sharif Bassioni, and there are a number of components, and the Prijedor municipality investigation was just one component of that.
I decided I wanted to have interviewed survivors from the area in different countries, and I enlisted in doing that professionals, meaning judges, lawyers, policemen, and immigration officers in different countries.
Did you yourself go to Prijedor to interview witnesses remaining there?
No, I did not, for very specific reasons. One was, at the time, the Serbian authorities did not want us to go.
So that was an impediment, that we could never ever get the assistance of the Republika Srpska, and everything we had to do, we had to battle day in and day out.
The first testimonies were given to the Commission of Experts by Bosniaks and Croats who were deported from Prijedor and scattered around the world.
The Commission of Experts had identified many witnesses, and they had been living in Australia, in Malaysia, in the United States, in Sweden, Germany, the United Kingdom, Denmark, etc., etc.
In May of 1993, following a preliminary report of the Commission of Experts, the Security Council established the first international criminal tribunal after World War II.
We then, in May, voted on how of 93, voted on how the procedures of the tribunal would work. And then still nobody thought it would work. They said that there never would be any indictees, and then they said there would never be any trials, and then they said there would never be any convictions, and there would never be any sentencing.
Despite the initial skepticism, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia did take root. The first judges were elected, rules of procedure and evidence were adopted, and the newly founded Office of the Prosecutor began its first investigations.
But what we decided to do in the very early days was to go where we knew the evidence was, and that was in the municipality of Prijedor. So that was probably our very first investigation that we did set up. And we were able to assemble a brief of evidence where by January, February of 1995 we were able to issue indictments for the camp personnel in Omarska, and then shortly after that for the camp personnel in Keraton. And that ranged from the commander of the camp right down to the lowest prison guard. And we concentrated on mainly the most serious crimes.
The first investigations did not go smoothly. The war was still raging in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
The major obstacle that I found coming from a law enforcement background, we weren't able to get access to the crime scenes probably for nearly 3 years after the crimes had occurred.
In May of 1996, the first international criminal trial after Nuremberg and Tokyo started. The case against Duško Tadić, a local politician from Kozarac near Prijedor, paved the way for other cases and proved that international criminal justice can be enforced.
This is the beginning of the first trial before the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, an international tribunal specially created by the United Nations to try persons charged with serious violations of international humanitarian law in the former Yugoslavia. As such an occasion, this has certain historic dimensions. Nevertheless, we should all remember, first and foremost, that this is a criminal trial of an accused who, a little over 1 year ago, appeared before this chamber and entered a plea of not guilty. Under any system of justice, he is entitled to a fair trial, and to ensure that he receives one is our paramount purpose for being here. The lawyers appearing on each side of this case come from different legal systems, as do each of we three judges, but we all agree on one premise, and that is that the rule of law must be upheld, and that fairness is the cornerstone of the process of affording justice.
The first trial also marked the beginning of judicial establishment of facts about the events in Prijedor in the summer of 1992.
Through this trial, we'll embark upon an examination of events of unspeakable horror. What man has done to man in the cause of nationalism or an ethnic hegemony in the former Yugoslavia strains the most agile of human reasoning.
And from the witness chair, the story of the camps emerged.
30. aprila rano ujutro u 6 sati nazvao me Šistek Sakip, sekretar opštinskog odbora SDA, i rekao mi: Mirza, znaš li šta je novo? Ja sam rekao: šta? Pa Prijedor je sinoć okupiran.
Za nesrpsko stanovništvo život je bio jako težak i mučan. Imali smo ograničeno kretanje. Ako biste otišli nešto da uzmete sebi u dućan, morali ste nositi bijele trake. Na prozorima naših kuća i stanova morali su biti izvješene bijele zastave.
Trial chambers in Tadic and subsequent cases heard witness after witness describe the violent takeover of non-Serb towns and villages in the entire municipality of Prijedor.
Kozarac je tad granatiran od nedelje od 14 sati do 5 sati ujutru 26. Intenzivno granatiran. Sijeli su granate ko sijačicom kad se siješ pšenica, cak, 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 cak.
Negdje oko 10, odnosno 11 časova, bilo je strašno pogledati. Kompletan dio, sve kuće su gorjele. Sve jedna do druge, ogroman plamen. Vrlo rijetka pusnjava se tad mogla čuti. A od nekih ljudi koji su uspjeli pobjeći od ozgo, izvući se iz skloništa i pobjeći, mogli smo saznati da pješadija srpska ulazi i da pali kuće jednu po jednu, sve redom. To su radili nekim bombama koje su bile vrlo efikasne. Za nekoliko minuta svaka kuća je potpuno bila izgorjela.
The most dramatic was, of course, towards the end of that journey towards Prijedor, where the main road goes through the edge of Kozarac. We didn't go up into the center of the town, but you could see house after house after house burned, incinerated, and people had obviously left very quickly. I remember Penny Marshall, my colleague from ITN, pointing out shoes that had been left on the doorstep. You know, it had been that violent, that quick, and surreally there were houses intact. Just a few around where the Serbs were living and carrying on with their washing and their animals as though nothing had happened, surrounded by this devastation.
Evidence also showed that the crisis staff of the Serbian municipality of Prijedor established 3 camps for non-Serb civilians: Omarska, Karaterm, and Ternopolje.
Like on the 24th, 25th, 26th of May 1992 was when Kozarac was taken, and it was only then that the men were taken to Omarska or to Karaterm, the women, the children, the elderly were then taken to Ternopolje, and then subsequently moved, deported.
The chambers found that the inmates of these camps were held in inhumane conditions, with little or no food, without access to water and sanitary facilities.
To je bila jedna obična garaža za auto, koliko sam ja mogao da primijetim. I tu su nas smjestili sve. Koliko nas je bilo u tom trenutku, 150, 160, tu negdje. Uglavnom, unutra nije bilo prostora da se sjedne, svi smo stojali. Od tog momenta svi smo stojali i kao sardine smo bili.
The witness statements were corroborated in trials with findings of investigations carried out by the Office of the Prosecutor.
We worked to corroborate what the witnesses had told us prior to us being able to go there, that they were beaten with blunt instruments in the hangar building. We were able to find those types of instruments. They were hung up by hooks of the machinery in the hangar building. We were able to find those hooks and photograph them and things like that.
Were prisoners regularly called out of rooms?
I jesu stalno prezirali.
And as far as you could tell, what happened to those prisoners?
Koliko ja znam, bilo je ljudi koji je izvede pa tuču i uvedu ga unutra, on je mrtav, donesu ga i vama samo ga bace unutra u sobu. A bilo je ljudi koji se nisu ni vratili, koji je prezvalo nije se ni vratio i ne zna se za njega ni danas ništa.
But the amount of sexual assault in this particular war was really eye-opening for me. And it seemed to be something with the guards, particularly in Karaterm, and to a degree in Omarska, but particularly Karaterm. And the people who visited the camps, your Kneževićes and Žigićes and Banovićes, they seemed to enjoy making the detainees commit sexual acts upon each other. And I'd never seen anything like that before. So that came as a real shock.
Jedan od Banovića, ne znam koji, skinuo mi je trenerku, prisilio me da ustanem, to je polusvjesno stanje, ja sam u stvari ležao, tu su bile nekve tačke, to vam je kolica, nekva od njih sam se oslonao nekako, ustao sam, oni su mi spustili trenerku, gaće, tog Tarzana su, morao je kleknuti dole, pritom su ga tukli, tada, po glavi, leđima. Ja se izvinjam kompletnom tu auditoriju. Uzeli su moj penis i stavili su njemu u usta. I tukli su ga i tada, tad sam i ja osjetio bolove, dole, testisi, donji taj dio, palca je bila u pitanju policajska. Vrlo ponižavajuće, mislim, bijedno.
The things that we'd seen in the video recordings that Penny Marshall had taken, we found exactly the same things there. The White House, the administration building, the hangar building. In the White House, part of our investigation was that they were probably the most brutal beatings and murders occurred in the White House. The politicians, the police, the religious leaders, the elite of the society, if I can put it that way, things that society depends on. They were taken into the White House, and they were a lot of really bad things occurred there.
To su mi rekli momci koje sam zatekao u toj prostoriji, da imaju igranku i kao kusi baš došao sinoć, jer ova grupa je najgora, ova smjena. Igranka se sastojala od položaja koji mi je ujedno i objasnio zašto je krv na određenoj visini od poda bila po čitavoj sobi. To je položaj kleknuti na koljena, ruke na leđa, a čelom biti oslonjen od zid. Tako smo morali prići svi zidu u krug, da bi stražari ušli, tuča u glavu, u leđa i razbijanje faktički i nosa, i zuba, i čela, i arkada. A između ostalog bila su dva momka kojima je bilo polomljeno u skočnom zglobu, jer su nisu pogrešno, nego nisu razmišljali o tome da im neko može stati na skočni zglob pa im slomiti to. To je bila igranka.
What we're able to do a test in the White House and in other areas of the camp as well, where we had specific allegations of particularly brutal crimes. And we were able to still prove that there was human blood, or there were traces of human blood on things like the heaters, where it's impossible almost to clean. Doesn't matter how well you clean up, you will still find traces.
Beatings and sexual violence were not the only crimes to which inmates were subjected. The chambers found that hundreds of inmates lost their lives in the Prijedor camps. In just one incident in Karaterm, the Serb forces used heavy machine guns to kill over 100 people locked up in room number 3.
And we also did that in the Karaterm camp. There was a particularly bad massacre, a brutal massacre on the 24th of July 1992, which became known as the Room 3 massacre.
Znam da je fino sjevalno ispod vrata i da se onda dim počeo prostirati po spavoni i onda je počelo pomjeranje, onda je počelo i pucanje svana. Počeli su da pucaju svana, da vam kažem koliko je trajalo, ja ne znam. Znam da je par ljudi ispred mene, možda 4 do 5, možda i 6 ljudi palo, pokošeni. Tako da su mene pomjerili nazad, ali ne na leđa, već sam se ja uspio da ne potrebuške da se skupim i tako da su 3 do 4 čovjeka pala meni na leđa, ovako do pola leđa. To su bili mrtvi ljudi, pokošeni ljudi.
We were able to do the luminal test in there, and it was so dramatic that you could almost tell when all the lights were out and the luminal had been painted onto the floor, when it started to work and it was showing signs for blood. You could tell sneaker patterns, that somebody was wearing this particular type of sneaker and that type of sneaker.
At the beginning of August, after it was made known that British journalists would visit, the crisis staff urgently began evacuating Omarska and Karaterm. Some of the inmates were transferred to Camp Manjača near Banja Luka, which was run by the Army of Republika Srpska. Most of the inmates were transferred to Camp Ternoplje and subsequently deported.
Jedan dio je došao prije nego što je stigla Penny Marshall. Stigli su najprvo žene i maloljetni, teško bolesni iz Omarske. Onda su stigli, mislim, Karaterm. Tada su stigli novinari i poslije toga je stigao po noći, možda oko pola noći, veliki konvoj iz Omarske.
On the very day of the journalists' arrival, more than 120 inmates were taken on buses from Karaterm and Omarska. Their destiny remained unknown for years.
Witness, can you describe for us the day that you left the Karaterm camp?
To je bilo 5. augusta, oko 9 sati, došao je jedan vojnik i vikao je komandire soba da izađu na vrata svaki iz svoje sobe da stane tamo. I donio je jedan spisak i počeo čitati koje on prozove ljude da i on vamo prenosi u prostoriju. I kako je prozivalo, tako su ljudi izlazili vani. Došla su 2 autobusa, pokupli i odvezli.
Ljudi taj dan doveženi u Omarsku, da su kratko bili, da su isti dan ponovno putovali u autobuse i odveženi u nepoznatom pravcu.
Did you hear if any of the prisoners from Omarska were put onto the buses during that stop?
Meni je poznato samo jedno ime, kaže da su ubacili još par, ne znam koliko.
What is the name of the one person you know from Omarska who was ordered onto the bus?
Dr. Esad Sadiković.
Tu noć nikad neću zaboraviti. To je bila posljednja noć u logoru Omarska. Nama je izgledalo nekako stvarno mirna i tiha. Međutim, pred zoru otvorila su se vrata i na njima se pojavio stražar i rekao doktor Eso Sadiković neka iziđe i sa sobom ponese svoje stvari. Mi smo se iznenadili. Znamo da su Esu stalno često prozivali ranije da napravi nekakvu intervenciju, ali ovaj put kad smo rekli da ponese stvari, mi smo znali kuda ga vode. Doktor Eso je ustao, uzeo jednu svoju najlon vrećicu koje je bilo par cigareta koje su mu skupili logoraši, jednu prljavu košulju i krenuo je ka izlazu. Mi smo svi ustali, stali mirno. Iz 100 grla vikali smo hvala ti doktore na svemu. On se samo krenuo i rekao zbogom prijatelji. Nismo vjerovali da na ovom svijetu postoji zločinac koji može ubiti takvog čovjeka.
Did you determine whether any bodies have been exhumed from individuals who have been named by witnesses to have been on these buses that left the Karaturm camp and stopped in the Omarska camp on the 5th of August?
En effet, les autorités bosniaques ont exhumé, ou du moins, ont exhumé un charnier, zone qui s'appelle Rastova Glavica. Il s'agit d'une grotte à l'intérieur de laquelle 126 corps ont été retrouvés. Dans 121 cas, les médecins légistes ont pu déterminer que la cause de la mort résultait de blessures par arme à feu.
The chambers found that the crisis staff closed Omarska and Karatem in early August of 1992, but that did not mark the end of ethnic cleansing in the Prijedor municipality. In mid-August, members of the Prijedor Police Intervention Squad separated more than 200 men from a convoy on the Vlasic mountain. Only 12 survived the massacre at Korichanske Stijena.
I onda su nas proveli ispred autobusa, vratili nas nazad i sa autobusa i onda nas poredili na jednu ivicu gdje su se stvari desile. Da. Ja sam zaplovio dole u tu provaliju. Dok sam čuo ljude koji su već automatski počeli da plaču i oni su pucali dozgo, čak su i bombe bacali. Ja sam kad sam došao sebi sam vidio da na neku ludu sreću da sam imao da nisam povrijeđen i nisam mogao, još uvijek nisam bio svjestan u kojoj situaciji se nalazim. Ali sam
The accused for the crimes committed in Omarska, as a rule, did not deny that crimes were committed, but refuted any personal involvement in them. Zoran Zigic, whom even the camp guards recalled visiting the Prijedor camps daily to abuse inmates, had this to say about his role.
Ja sam po prirodi malo temperamentan čovjek, a malo imam, kod nas se to kaže, i duži jezik. Volim da psujem. Ja sam strašno galamio, psovao. Nisam ja birao da li su to muslimani, da li su Srbi, da li su moje kolege koji su došle sa mnom iz policijske stanice. Ne znam, jednostavno sam tražio pražnjenje iz samog sebe i to sam postizao psovanjem, galamom. A Boga mi, nažalost, desilo se neki put i da čušnem nekoga, ali nisam ja to gledao da li je to Srbin ili musliman. Ko mi je bio pri ruci, dobio je uz uši. Tako se to dešavalo.
Mlađo Radic, who was accused of abusing his position as shift leader to rape and sexually assault women detained in Omarska, denied his role in a similar way.
Da, po vašoj optužnici ispada da sam ja bio priplodni bik u Omarskoj. Po vašoj optužnici, gospodine Seksu. Ja ništa drugo nisam radio, nego sam eto tražio, iskao, skakao i tako dalje. A to da uradim gospođi je, ne znam ni kako ste rekli, u kancelariji, za koju ste vi ovdje čuli da je to bila prometna stanica u koju se ulazilo bez kucanja, bez ičega, u pol bijela dana i tako dalje, i po njenom svjedočenju da ja nju diram pod laticama bez skidanja gaćica i izvinjavam se, A ja sam u to vrijeme seksualno imao 40 godina, pa meni je trebalo nekog pristojnog života i predigre da doživim. Nisam ja od 15 godina dok vidim, izvinjavam se, onu stvar da doživim orgazam. Ja sam čovjek.
The trial chamber in the case against Kvočka and others was not convinced by these versions of events in Omarska.
Su de nombreux éléments de preuve qui démontrent qu'il n'était pas rare que des personnes extérieures au camp y pénétraient et se livrent à des diverses exactions sur les prisonniers. Monsieur Zizitch est de cela. Les femmes, elles, ne sont pas frappées. Certaines sont molestées, d'autres ou les mêmes sont violées. En d'autres termes, il n'est pas un seul lieu dans l'enceinte de camp d'Omarska où un détenu puisse se sentir en sécurité ou simplement espérer de ne pas être frappé ou subir des violences sous une forme ou sous une autre.
The chamber also found that the Omarska inmates were exposed daily to harassment, humiliation, and psychological abuse. For the first time in the history of international criminal law, it was recognized that these acts can, under certain circumstances, form a part of the crime of persecution. This was a groundbreaking contribution to the legal understanding and definition of this crime.
The appeals chamber has no doubt that, in the context in which they were committed, and taking into account their cumulative effect, the acts of harassment, humiliation, and psychological abuse, as found by the trial chamber, are acts which, by their gravity, constitute material elements of the crime of persecution.
The three accused for crimes in the Karaterm camp went one step further than their former colleagues from Omarska.
Nakon što sam vidio i shvatio posljedice, želim da kažem ovom uvaženom vijeću da strašno žalim zbog svega što se odigralo u Karatermu dok sam ja bio tamo. Osjećam samo žaljenje za sve živote koji su izgubljeni i živote koji su narušeni u Karatermu i Prijedoru 92. u događajima kojima sam nažalost i ja doprinio. Naročito mi je žao što nisam imao dovoljno moralne hrabrosti i moći da spriječim neke ili sve one grozne stvari koje su se dogodile.
Zatvoreni ljudi su bili moji sugrađani, bili su nevini i teško su patili. Nad tim ljudima izvršen je zločin i ja sam spreman da za taj zločin pred Bogom i ljudima preuzmem moj dio odgovornosti. Pokušavao sam da im pomognem, da im olakšam, da se njima razgovaram, da ih zaštitim. Uslovi pod kojima su oni bili zatvoreni bili su ispod svakog ljudskog dostojanstva.
Sada sam svjestan da sam tada bio oruđe u tuđim rukama i zbog toga se gorko kajem. Izražavam žaljenje zbog svih dijela, uključujući ono što sam trebao da učinim, a nisam dovoljno učinio. Svjestan sam da time ne mogu pružiti nadoknadu mojim prijedorčanima, ali se nadam da pružam doprinos nekom novom početku.
The evidence presented in trials clearly indicated the existence of an organized and systematic campaign in Prijedor, which involved political, military, and police structures of the municipality and beyond.
As a result of the Prijedor investigation, of the crime base of the Omarska camp, of Karaterm camp, to a certain degree Ternopolje, to the taking of Kozarac, the Bordeaux region and things like that, it led from the major perpetrators on the ground to the crisis staff, to Kovacevic, Druljača and Starkic, which then led to Bergin and Talic.
In the first half of 2002, two trials commenced before the tribunal in which political and military leaders of Prijedor and the autonomous region of Krajina were accused for crimes committed in Prijedor.
The military and political wings of the Bosnian Serbs were inextricably linked. the political wing provided the goal. The military and the police, who straddled the divide between the two arms, played their part in the achievement of these goals.
And there are still, you know, with Krajisnik, Mrs. Plavsic and Dr. Karadzic, there are still remnants of the Prijedor investigation in all of those indictments. So it's been a fairly wide-ranging investigation which has led to a number of indictments.
Da li su oni svesni da smo mi jedan narod?
That same year, former member of the war presidency of the Bosnian Serbs, Biljana Plavsic, accepted the responsibility for the campaign of organized and systematic persecution of non-Serbs in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Plavsic admitted that the goal of the campaign was to permanently remove non-Serb civilians from the area that Serbs claimed for themselves, including Prijedor.
Iako sam više puta bila upoznata sa navodima o surovim i neljudskim postupcima protiv nesrba, odbila sam da se sa tim suočim ili čak da ih provjerim. U stvari, ja sam se potpuno predala govorenju o nevinim srpskim žrtvama ovoga rata. I tako sam ja jednostavno poricala te navode, čak ih i ne proveravajući. Ostala sam sigurna u mom uverenju da Srbi nisu sposobni da učine nešto tako. U ovoj obsesiji da više nikada ne postanemo žrtve, dopustili smo sebi da postanemo počinioci.
2 years later, Momčilo Krajisnik, the wartime speaker of the Assembly of Bosnian Serbs, appeared before the judges of the tribunal. Krajisnik claimed that he was not informed.
Vidim veliki patriotizam I veliko rodoljublje.
Is it your testimony that before you arrived in The Hague, you never heard about expulsion of Muslims? Mr. Krajisnik, not from 1995 up till the moment that you were arrested?
Ja vas uvjeravam, gospodine predsjedavajući, iz svake opštine iz koje su izašli muslimani, s kim sam god razgovarao u kasnijim godinama, svi su rekli da su muslimani otišli dobrovoljno, da su želili da odu. Nikad nisam čuo ni od jednog lokalnog funkcionera da kažu da su protjerali muslimane.
Persecution against Bosnian Muslims and Bosnian Croats as a crime against humanity was committed in all 35 municipalities through the following acts: the imposition of restrictive and discriminatory measures involving the denial of fundamental rights, murder, cruel and inhumane treatment during attacks on towns and villages and within various detention centers, forcible displacement, unlawful detention, forced labor at front lines, appropriation or plunder of private property, and destruction of private property and of cultural monuments and sacred sites.
The trial chamber is satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that the crimes that were committed in the Bosnian Krajina from April 1992 until the end of December 1992 occurred as a direct result of the overarching strategic plan. The ethnic cleansing was not a byproduct of the criminal activity. It was its very aim. The conditions of life imposed on the non-Serb population of the Bosnian Krajina and the military operations against towns and villages, which were not military targets, were undertaken with the sole purpose of driving people away. By August 1992, the consistent application of such a discriminatory policy was completely clear to objective observers on the ground, and the evidence shows a consistent, coherent, and criminal strategy of cleansing the Bosnian Krajina of ethnic groups other than Bosnian Serbs, implemented by the SDS and the Bosnian Serb forces.
Coming back to the summary of the judgment of the case against Dr. Starkic, it is to be emphasized that many more were killed during the attacks by the Bosnian Serb army on predominantly Bosnian Muslim villages and towns throughout the municipality of Prijedor, Kozarac, Hambarine, Biskani, Ljubija, to name a few, and several massacres of Muslims took place additionally. The trial chamber has found that more than 1,500 killings occurred and has been able to identify by name 486 names. Rapes and sexual assaults were committed in the camps, and the thousands of persons detained were subjected to inhumane and degrading treatment, including routine beatings and torture. Bosnian Muslims who had lived their whole lives in the municipality of Prijedor were expelled from their homes and deported in huge numbers. More than 20,000 persons, calculated conservatively, 20,000 persons became victims of this campaign of deportation.
Chambers assessed that the gravity of the crimes for which Krajisnik, Berjanin and Starkic were sentenced demanded long-term prison sentences.
For your role in these crimes, we sentence you, Mr. Krajisnik, to a single sentence of 27 years of imprisonment.
We sentence you, Radoslav Berjanin, to a single sentence of 32 years of imprisonment.
Dr. Milomir Starkic is hereby sentenced to life imprisonment.
Even though the appeals chamber later somewhat reduced the length of these sentences, factual findings about the extent and nature of the crimes committed in Prijedor remain irrefutable. This significantly assisted in the prosecution of the accused before the court of Bosnia and Herzegovina, including the 4 accused who were transferred from the tribunal.
Dakle, kada je sud Bosne i Hercegovine 2005. godine osnovao odjel za ratne zločine, mogu sa zadovoljstvom reći da je u regiji prvi počeo primjenjivati praksu Haškog tribunala u svojim odlukama. To je uveliko olakšalo rad našim vijećima jer nisu morali ponavljati postupak utvrđivanja određenih činjenica koje je Haški tribunal već preuzeo.
"20 years after the British journalist exposed the existence of camps around Prijedor to the world, the crimes were investigated, the offenders identified, and the room for denial continues to shrink.
Hajde da prihvatimo neke stvari koje su kao istina, van razumne sumnje, utvrđene u sudskim postupcima. Mislim da bi to za početak bilo dovoljno. Što se toga tiče, ja lično nemam nikakav problem s tim. Ja sam to pokazao tokom suđenja, da nemam uopšte problem da se suočim sa svim onim što je van razumne sumnje dokazano u predmetu Omarska. Niko ne može negirati da u Omarskoj se nisu desili zločini. Niko ne može to negirati.
The extensive efforts of the investigators, prosecutors, and judges of the tribunal played a key role in establishing the facts and bringing those responsible to justice. A clear message was sent that the facts about crimes cannot and will not remain unseen. The success of the tribunal proved that international criminal law can be a viable tool for bringing war criminals to justice and justice to victims around the world.
You know, one of its achievements very early on, in a way more so early on, was this narrative for the annals of history. Whether history cared to listen or not is another matter. But the story was told of what happened.